I didn't know it yet, but the folder sitting unopened in my inbox that Friday afternoon was about to accuse me of stealing over $300,000 from a company I'd given 8 years of my life to, and the two people who actually did it were sitting 4 feet away from me at the time, close enough that I could hear one of them laugh. I want you to remember that laugh, because by the time this story is over, you're going to understand exactly what it meant, and exactly how long it had been happening right under my nose. This isn't a simple story about getting blamed for something. There's a turn coming that changes everything you think you understand about who the villain actually is, and I need you to stay with me until the very end to see it land. If you like a story that gets colder and sharper the longer it goes on, subscribe now, because this one earns every single minute. And tell me in the comments, have you ever worked closely with someone for years without ever suspecting what they were actually capable of? My name is Simone. I was 37, and for 8 years I'd worked in the finance department of a mid-size manufacturing company, most recently as a senior accounts manager, overseeing vendor payments and contract renewals for our largest suppliers. It's not a glamorous job, and most people outside of finance don't understand what it actually involves. I approved vendor invoices, reconciled purchase orders against delivered goods, flagged discrepancies before they became real problems, and generally made sure the money leaving our accounts matched something real on the other end. I was good at it. I was careful, methodical, the kind of person who noticed a decimal point out of place before it ever became a 5-figure mistake. I worked closely with 2 people in particular, Patrick, a procurement manager who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, handled vendor relationships and contract negotiations, the person who actually brought new suppliers into our system and set the terms I later processed payments against, and Whitney, a mid-level accountant on my own team, someone I'd trained personally 3 years earlier, someone I trusted enough to hand off entire vendor reconciliations to, without double-checking every line. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further. I liked both of them. Patrick had an easy, confident way about him in meetings, the kind of person who made vendor negotiations feel effortless, who could walk a nervous supplier through a difficult contract renewal and somehow leave them thanking him for it. Whitney was quieter, competent in a way that never called attention to itself, always the first one to volunteer for the tedious reconciliation work nobody else wanted. She used to bring in coffee for the whole team on Monday mornings, small gestures that, looking back, I never once thought to read as anything other than genuine kindness. We'd worked side by side through 2 company reorganizations, a system migration that nearly broke all of us for a month straight, and enough ordinary office milestones, birthdays, a work anniversary lunch, the year our department won a small internal recognition award, that I considered both of them, in the loose, comfortable way you consider longtime coworkers, something close to friends. I had no reason, across years of working alongside them, to suspect either one of anything at all. That's exactly what made what happened next so devastating. Trust like that doesn't just get broken, it gets used. The folder in my inbox that Friday afternoon was from our internal audit team, and it wasn't addressed to me as a colleague being looped in on a concern. It was addressed to me as the subject of an investigation. I was called into a conference room 20 minutes after opening it, where our director of finance and someone from human resources were waiting with printed documents already laid out on the table. "We've identified a pattern of payments to a vendor called Aldridge Supply Solutions," the director said, sliding a stack of invoices toward me. "Nearly $340,000 over the past 14 months. The vendor doesn't appear to have any actual operating presence, no verifiable business address, no other clients we can find, nothing beyond a bank account that receives these payments, and a shell registration filed just before the first invoice came through." I looked through the invoices. I recognized the format instantly. Our own internal template, the one only a handful of people in the finance department had access to generate. "Every one of these invoices was approved under your login credentials," the director continued. "The vendor was added to our system under your employee ID. We need you to explain what you know about Aldridge Supply Solutions." I stared at the paperwork in front of me, and for a long moment, I genuinely couldn't process what I was looking at. I had never heard the name Aldridge Supply Solutions in my life. I had never approved a single one of those invoices. And yet there it was, my login, my employee ID, my name attached to every page. "I've never seen this vendor before," I said, and I could hear how thin my own voice sounded, the specific hollow tone of someone realizing they're being accused of something they can't yet prove they didn't do. "I don't know how my credentials got attached to this. We understand this is serious," the HR representative said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Until the investigation concludes, we need to place you on administrative leave and restrict your system access." I walked out of that meeting and out of the building 20 minutes later with a box of my desk belongings, past Patrick's office, past Whitney's desk, neither of whom looked up as I passed, both of them apparently absorbed in something on their screens. I remember thinking, at the time, how strange it was that neither of them even glanced over at the sight of me being escorted out with a cardboard box. Whitney had walked past my desk 100 times over the years to grab something or ask a quick question. That afternoon, she didn't so much as turn her head. I understand now exactly why they didn't need to look up. They already knew precisely what was in that box, and precisely why I was carrying it. I sat in my car in the parking garage for almost half an hour before I trusted myself to drive, the box on the passenger seat, my hands still shaking slightly from the particular kind of shock that comes from being blamed for something you know, with absolute certainty, you had no part in. I called my husband from that parking garage, and I remember struggling to even get the sentence out coherently. "They think I stole money from the company," I finally managed. $300,000. "I don't understand what's happening." I also called my sister that first night, mostly because I needed to say the words out loud to someone who wouldn't immediately try to fix it, who would just let me be as confused and frightened as I actually felt. She didn't have advice for me either. She just stayed on the phone for almost 2 hours while I cried, and second-guessed every interaction I'd had with Patrick and Whitney over the past year, trying to find the moment I should have seen this coming. I want to be honest about what those weeks actually felt like, because I think people underestimate how disorienting it is to be accused of something you know, with total certainty, that you didn't do, while having absolutely no way to prove it. The hardest part wasn't even the financial uncertainty, though that was real too, sitting at home on unpaid administrative leave with no clear timeline for when, or whether, I'd have a job to return to. The hardest part was smaller and stranger. A former coworker who used to text me memes during boring meetings simply stopped responding. A neighbor who worked in a different department at the same company started saying hello a little too carefully, a little too briefly, the way people do when they've heard a version of a story and don't quite know how to act around you anymore. I hadn't been convicted of anything. I hadn't even been formally accused in public, but the silence around me had already started rendering its own verdict, long before any investigation had actually concluded. I couldn't access company systems. I couldn't pull my own login history, couldn't see the actual invoice creation logs, couldn't do anything except sit at home replaying 14 months of my own work, trying to remember any single moment that could explain how a vendor I'd never approved had been sitting in our system under my name for over a year. I called a former coworker who'd left the company 2 years earlier for advice, a woman named Odalise who now worked in forensic accounting at a different firm entirely. She was the first person who suggested something that reframed the entire problem for me. "Employee credentials get compromised more often than people think," she told me over the phone. "But more often than that, in cases like this, someone with legitimate access uses someone else's login specifically because they know it'll be harder to trace back to them. Ask yourself who else had physical or system access to your workstation, who covered for you when you were out, who knew your schedule well enough to know exactly when you wouldn't be watching." I sat with that question for a long time, and the honest answer, the one I didn't want to land on, was almost everyone on my own team, because we worked in an open, trusting environment, where covering for each other during vacations and sick days was simply normal. That answer felt too large to be useful. I needed to narrow it down to something specific. I started, the way I always start any real problem, with dates. I pulled out a legal pad, something almost old-fashioned about the act of writing it all out by hand instead of typing it into a spreadsheet, but I wanted to see it in front of me, physically, in a way that felt slower and more deliberate than scrolling through a screen. I wrote down every date I could remember being out of the office over the past 14 months, cross-referencing against old calendar invites still sitting in my personal email, old text messages to my husband about picking up the kids because I was working from a hotel room during a conference. Anything that could anchor a specific day to a specific, provable absence. I requested, through the one HR contact still willing to speak with me, a full copy of the specific dates each Aldridge invoice had been approved under my credentials. It took almost 2 weeks of persistent, polite, written requests before I finally received them. 14 dates, spread out over 14 months, one invoice approved almost exactly once a month, like clockwork. I cross-referenced every single date against my own calendar, my email history, anything I still had access to on my personal accounts. And there it was, a pattern so clean it made my stomach turn the moment I saw it laid out in full. Every single one of those 14 approval dates fell on a day I was either out of the office on approved leave or working remotely from a location where I wouldn't have had access to generate a new vendor record in our system in the first place. Whoever did this hadn't picked dates at random. They had picked, with careful precision, 14 separate days across more than a year when they knew, with certainty, that I would not be sitting at my desk to notice a new vendor appearing in the queue. That level of precision told me something important. This wasn't an opportunistic theft that happened to get pinned on me by accident. Someone had been watching my schedule closely enough, for over a year, to time every single transaction around it. I thought immediately of one person, a junior analyst named Corbin, who'd joined our team 18 months earlier and had, from the very beginning, seemed a little too eager to take on extra reconciliation work, a little too interested in the specific mechanics of vendor approvals for someone at his level. I spent almost 10 days convinced it had to be him, quietly building a case in my head, remembering every overly curious question he'd ever asked me about our approval workflows. I was wrong, and the way I found out I was wrong changed the entire direction of everything that followed. I brought everything I had to Odalys. The 14 dates, my theory about Corbin, the pattern of absences that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. She listened to the whole thing patiently, and then asked me a question I hadn't thought to ask myself. Vendor records don't just need someone with your login, she said. They need someone with actual authority to add a new supplier into your procurement system in the first place. Does a junior analyst have that kind of access? Or does someone need sign-off from procurement before a vendor even gets created? I sat with that question, and slowly, uncomfortably, I understood exactly what she was pointing toward. Junior analysts didn't create new vendors, only procurement had that authority, which meant whoever had used my login to approve these invoices had needed someone else, someone in procurement, to have set up the vendor itself in the first place. Corbin couldn't have done this alone. He didn't have the standing to create a vendor record even if he'd wanted to. Odalys helped me pull the vendor's original creation record, not the invoices but the actual account setup, the initial paperwork that had brought Aldridge Supply Solutions into our system as an approved supplier 14 months earlier. That record required 2 signatures, one from procurement, authorizing the new vendor relationship, and one from finance, confirming the banking details were verified. The procurement signature belonged to Patrick. The finance verification, entered under a login that wasn't mine this time, belonged to Whitney. I want to slow down here, because understanding exactly how this worked is the part of the story that matters most. Patrick had used his legitimate procurement authority to create Aldridge Supply Solutions as an approved vendor, listing banking details that, once Odalys traced them further, connected to an account jointly held by Patrick and a woman whose last name matched Whitney's mother. Whitney had verified those banking details under her own login, a routine step that, in an honest transaction, exists specifically to confirm a new vendor is real. In this case, it had simply confirmed a fiction. Once the vendor existed in the system, all that remained was generating monthly invoices and getting them approved without raising suspicion. That's where I came in, entirely without my knowledge. Whitney, who I had trained personally, who reconciled vendor accounts alongside me every single week, had access to my workstation on the days I was out. She knew my schedule intimately, Because as my trusted team member, she was the one who often covered my desk during my absences in the first place. She used my still logged-in session, on days she knew I wouldn't be checking my own activity remotely, to approve invoices that looked, to anyone glancing at the system, exactly like routine work I'd done myself. Patrick and Whitney weren't simply coworkers who happened to collaborate on a scheme. Odalise found something else. Buried in an internal HR system, neither of them thought anyone would ever cross-reference against a fraud investigation. A shared home address, filed on an old benefits enrollment form from 2 years earlier, back when Whitney had briefly listed Patrick as an emergency contact, before quietly changing it a few months later to a cousin's name instead. Once we had that thread, other small details that had never meant anything on their own started falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. The two of them always seemed to take their lunch breaks around the same time, though I'd never once thought to notice a pattern in it. They'd carpooled to an off-site training session 18 months earlier, something I remembered only because I'd made a passing joke about it at the time, and both of them had laughed it off just a beat too quickly. They weren't just colleagues working together. They had been quietly involved with each other for years, hiding it from a company with a strict policy against undisclosed relationships between employees at different levels of financial authority, a policy that existed, ironically, for exactly the kind of situation they'd created. I sat with all of this for several days before deciding what to do, and I want to be honest about the version of this story I almost told instead. Part of me wanted to go to Patrick and Whitney directly, together, and confront them with everything I'd found, watch their faces, hear them try to explain themselves, get the kind of raw, immediate reaction I'd been imagining for weeks, while I sat at home with a box of my own belongings and no way to defend myself. I didn't do that. And I'm glad, because by that point I understood something important. Confronting them privately would only give them time to destroy whatever evidence remained before I could get it in front of someone with actual authority to act on it. A private confrontation would feel satisfying for about 10 minutes and accomplish absolutely nothing beyond warning them. Instead, Odalise and I built a single, clean, chronological document, the 14 dates, my verified absences, the vendor creation record with both their signatures, the banking details connecting to Patrick's account, the old emergency contact form connecting them personally, and I requested a meeting, not with HR, not with the director of finance who'd already decided I was the problem, but directly with our CEO, a measured, detail-oriented man named Desmond who I had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in 8 years, always briefly, always in passing. Getting that meeting took persistence I didn't know I had left in me. I was told, twice, that Desmond's assistant would pass along my request when appropriate. I wrote back both times, politely, specifying that this concerned a fraud investigation, currently naming me as a suspect, and that I had documentation directly relevant to identifying who was actually responsible. The third request got a response within the hour. Desmond read through the document I'd prepared in near silence for almost 15 minutes, while I sat across from him saying nothing, letting the pages do exactly what they needed to do. He had a habit, I noticed, of pausing at each new page for a few extra seconds, as though he wanted to be certain he'd absorbed it correctly before allowing himself to move forward. A kind of deliberate carefulness I found myself grateful for after weeks of decisions being made about my life, without anyone examining them quite that closely. "Walk me through this vendor creation record again," he said finally, tapping the page with both signatures. "You're telling me the same 2 employees who set up this account are the ones whose login was used to approve every single invoice against it." "That's what the records show," I said. "I didn't create this vendor. I've never once approved an Alderidge invoice. Every date these invoices went through, I was verifiably somewhere else, and I have the documentation to prove it. And this banking account," he said, sliding the printout toward the center of the table, "it's connected to Patrick, personally." "Through a relative," I said. "Whitney's mother, according to the account records Odalise traced, and there's a benefits form showing Whitney once listed Patrick as her emergency contact, filed 2 years ago." Desmond leaned back slightly in his chair, and for the first time since I'd walked in, something like real weariness crossed his face. Not doubt in what I was telling him, but the specific fatigue of a person realizing how much had been happening under his own roof without his knowledge. He was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet of someone doing real math in his head, recalculating an entire narrative he'd been given weeks earlier by people he'd trusted to hand him an accurate one. "I want you to understand something," he said finally. "I signed off on your administrative leave based on what looked, at the time, like a straightforward case. I'm going to need everything you have, formally, in writing, and I'm going to need to bring in an outside forensic team before this goes any further. But I want to say this clearly. Right now, before any of that happens, I don't believe, sitting here with this in front of me, that you did what you were accused of." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in almost 6 weeks. I remained on unpaid leave for the remainder of that process, my savings account thinning faster than I liked to check, my husband picking up extra freelance work to fill the gap, both of us trying not to talk about it too much at dinner, because there was only so much reassurance either of us could offer the other about something neither of us controlled. But for the first time since that Friday afternoon, the uncertainty felt like it was finally moving in the right direction. Desmond moved faster than I expected, once he understood what he was actually looking at. Within days, an outside forensic accounting team was brought in, independent of anyone already inside the finance department, specifically because Desmond wanted a review nobody at the company could be accused of influencing. Patrick and Whitney were both placed on administrative leave within the week, the same quiet, unceremonious process that had been used against me, except this time attached to the actual evidence instead of a convenient scapegoat. I heard, secondhand, that Patrick tried to argue his way through the initial meeting, insisting the banking connection was a coincidence. A family account he'd simply forgotten was still linked to old paperwork. Whitney, according to the same second-hand account, didn't say much of anything at all. I didn't get to watch that meeting happen, and honestly, by that point, I didn't need to. I'd gotten what I actually came for, the truth, in writing, in front of the one person with the authority to act on it. The forensic team's full review, completed over the following month, confirmed everything Odalise and I had already found, and uncovered 2 additional shell vendors neither of us had known to look for, both following the same pattern, both tracing back to accounts connected to Patrick. The total amount, once everything was accounted for, came to just over $500,000 across nearly 2 years, considerably more than the $340,000 originally attributed to me alone. I remember sitting with that number for a long time, doing the uncomfortable math of realizing how long this had actually been running, quietly, underneath years of Monday morning coffee and easy conference room charm. I was formally cleared within 6 weeks of that meeting with Desmond, reinstated with full back pay, and, something I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did, a written, company-wide notice clarifying that the earlier investigation had wrongly implicated me, and that the actual parties responsible had been identified and were no longer employed by the company. Here's what actually stayed with me, more than the relief of being cleared or the satisfaction of watching the truth finally land where it belonged. I spent 6 weeks isolated by an accusation I had no ability to disprove on my own, because the people who orchestrated it understood something important. It's far easier to destroy someone's credibility quickly than it is to rebuild it slowly. They didn't need a perfect frame. They just needed one convincing enough to survive the first pass of scrutiny, timed carefully enough around my own absences that the pattern would look, to anyone glancing at it quickly, exactly like negligence on my part, instead of theft on theirs. I want to be honest about something else, too. I got through this because I refused to accept the vague shape of an accusation as the whole story, and because I had one person, Odalise, willing to help me look at the actual mechanics of what had happened, instead of just the emotional weight of being blamed. If you are ever accused of something at work with documentation that looks damning on the surface, the most important thing you can do is stop reacting to the accusation itself and start asking how it was actually constructed. Who had access? Who benefited? Who had the authority to set the pieces in motion in the first place? I think, too, about how much of this depended on things I could just as easily not have had. Not everyone has a former coworker with forensic accounting expertise willing to spend evenings on the phone helping them for free. Not everyone gets a CEO who reads 15 pages of evidence slowly and carefully, instead of deferring entirely to whatever internal recommendation already exists. I was fortunate in ways that shouldn't have been necessary just to prove I hadn't done something I never did. That unfairness sat with me for a long time afterward, and honestly, it still does. The person I suspected first, Corbin, had nothing to do with any of it. He was simply eager and a little awkward, traits that looked suspicious to me only because I badly needed somewhere to point my fear. The people actually responsible were the two colleagues I trusted the most, the two people whose competence I had praised, whose personal lives I had never once thought to question, because nothing about how they behaved in that office ever hinted at what they were quietly building together outside of it. If you're sitting with an accusation right now that doesn't add up, that feels too convenient, too precisely timed around exactly the moments you weren't watching, I'm not telling you every accusation like that hides a conspiracy. But I am telling you this: don't let the speed and confidence of an accusation convince you it must be true. Ask for the actual mechanics. Ask who had the access and the authority to build it. The truth, in my experience, is almost always sitting quietly in the details nobody thought to check first. If you've ever had an accusation land on you from somewhere you never expected, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if you want more stories like this, subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. I don't think about Patrick and Whitney much anymore. I think about the version of myself who sat in that parking garage that first afternoon, certain her whole life had just quietly ended over something she never did. I wish I could go back and tell her it wasn't over. It was just about to become the part of the story she'd actually be proud of.